Welcome to today's webcast, where we're going to be talking about the NICE Workforce Framework for Cybersecurity. I'm really excited to have Karen Wetzel from the NICE National Initiative for Cybersecurity with us today to go into some really good detail about what you can glean from this particular framework and how it's ultimately going to be able to help develop your organizational cybersecurity structure. Karen, really nice meeting you today, and I'm looking forward to having a good conversation. If you don't mind, Karen, do you mind going into what you've been doing in terms of building up this framework and a little bit of background into this framework and also the establishment that has helped support this framework?
Absolutely, and thanks so much for having me, Kevin. Appreciate it. As you mentioned, I'm manager for the NICE framework here at NICE, which is a program in NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is under the U.S. Department of Commerce. And the NICE framework, or the special publication 800-181, the Workforce Framework for Cybersecurity, is establishes a common language to describe cybersecurity work and what people need to know or be able to do to complete that work. Essentially, it becomes that model that allows us to develop an ecosystem of stakeholders across cybersecurity. It's used by organizations looking to assess their workforce needs, learners who want to understand about the different kinds of cybersecurity roles that exist, job seekers who may need to evidence or demonstrate their capabilities, and hiring managers who are looking to bring in or develop staff to meet organizational demands. The NICE framework has its foundations in earlier stages where with the federal government agencies, we realized that there was an inconsistency in how different roles were being described. And so they came together in order to do that in the NICE framework. It's been extended, of course, to be able to be used in both public and private industry, in organizations large and small, and across sectors. And we revised it recently, fairly recently, in 2020, in order to be more agile, responsive, as well as be more modular and interoperable.
Oh, that's awesome to hear. And in fact, you brought up a few really interesting points there. One of which that I heard is that this is both for the public and the private sector. Is that correct?
That's right, absolutely. We really realize it is an ecosystem, as I stated, where we all are working together. We are working with academia and from K-12 into academia to be able to help train people who are going to be coming into this field. It may be people who are coming into federal jobs. It may be coming into state or local or tribal areas. It may be people who are looking in the private industry. And there's oftentimes going to be people who shift from one industry to another. And so we really want it to be a national framework that can be used across sectors. It could be used for people in organizations that have a lot of resources to develop their cybersecurity workforce or fewer. And it is really meant to be flexible, as I stated.
Oh, that's fantastic. The one thing I pick up is that not only is it for private and public, but it's also for organizations that might have 2 people. It might be for organizations that have 200,000 people. And from an HR perspective, you feel that they would be able to look at this particular framework and be able to apply it to some of their cybersecurity workforce needs?
Yes, at its foundation, the NICE framework has what we call the building blocks, essentially the task, knowledge, and skill statements. As I stated, the task statements really are meant to describe the work to be done, whereas the knowledge and skill statements are really looking more at the person and what they are able to bring to that work in terms of their knowledge and their skills and demonstrating that. It's how they complete the work to be done. We use those in the NICE framework in a couple of major ways, and that includes via work roles, which are groups of tasks for which someone or a team might be responsible for in a common area, or in competency areas, which we introduced with our 2020 revision. Because there are 52 different work roles, we're still, and the competency areas are shifting, and we have a number of those as well. It means that a small organization can look and say, I have maybe a handful of staff working on this, and they may need to be responsible for more than one work role, and are able to see how that works out in a job description. Whereas in a larger organization, you might have a larger team or have more cybersecurity requirements, organizational needs. And so you're able to look at our framework and look at those statements and understand which of those are going to be pertinent to your organization.
It's so interesting that you bring that up because it reminds me a little bit of some of the cybersecurity frameworks that I work on as an IT security manager. We have the Center for Information Security frameworks that are good for really large organizations, but they're also just as effective for an organization that is just starting up. And those cybersecurity needs are just as important for the smaller business as it is for the larger organizations, it sounds like, correct?
Absolutely. It is something where looking at the different work roles, you'll see different kinds of positions too, or different kinds of areas of work that an organization might need. And your organization might not need all of them, certainly will not need all of them. They range from things in the areas of policy and organizational oversight to things that may be more specific to federal intelligence roles. And so obviously it is going to be a matter of what is your needs, understanding that. And that's where workforce assessment is so important, and how the framework can help that as well, is looking at and understanding what your needs are overall, and then which roles are going to be most important for your organization.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, let's take a bit of a step back. NICE is also part of NIST. Do you mind just going into a little bit of background of what is NIST and ultimately how this framework starts fitting into what NIST is doing for not only private, public sectors, but also for the entire country as well?
Sure. NIST is the National Institute for Standards and Technology. As I said, it was part of the Department of Commerce. And that's really important because it does show how we are working in that workforce space. It is Department of Commerce. It is really working with that private and public industry. And we work very closely with other parts of NIST. NIST does all sorts of different kinds of work. But when it comes to the cybersecurity area, we're very strong there. And so, for instance, we work with the cybersecurity framework, which describes at a higher level more of the what of cybersecurity and a little bit of the how. We focus more on the how and the who in the NICE framework. We work, for instance, with our areas when it comes to operational technologies and how that works with cybersecurity. And we translate that in, of course, to the NICE framework again. And then that goes for risk assessment, for privacy, for all sorts of different areas that are emerging as well, for instance, in AI. And so looking at the cybersecurity implications of these things that are happening through other parts of NIST and being able to accommodate that and align to that in the NICE framework.
So it sounds like, especially from that HR perspective, many folks that are aligned to IT or cybersecurity are probably familiar with NIST, but maybe aren't as familiar with the framework that we're discussing today along the way, correct?
Yeah, and it's really, I think, a useful tool, particularly for those HR folks who may be aware of the need for cybersecurity, but aren't quite certain how to translate that into their job descriptions or into their hiring processes. And the NICE framework can help with that. It can help to establish those processes in an organization. And for those HR managers who maybe aren't the experts when it comes to cybersecurity, but need to have that language to describe these roles, to describe what the requirements are, and to understand how they're going to assess the folks that they're trying to bring into their organization.
You bring up some really great points, and it reminds me a little bit of when I have job descriptions out and I'm working with some of the good folks in the HR department, and they'll look at some of the job description requirements and they'll say, hey, Kevin, what exactly are you interested in? What are some of the top priorities? What are some of the secondary priorities? And then, hey, maybe I need a little bit of reminder of what some of the job description requirements are, right? So as I have that conversation with the applicant, and it could be an external applicant or an internal applicant, that they know some of the good questions to ask. So they're able to also screen folks for our organization within the cybersecurity area along the way as well. So it ends up being a really good review of cybersecurity for the HR professionals, and also it's going to help them be successful and get some of the great candidates that are out there into organizations that ultimately are trying to develop their cybersecurity workforce. Well, Karen, we talked a lot about some of the background of the framework. Why don't we go into some of the details of the framework? Maybe starting from a bit of a high level and then going down to some of the details that really would be pertinent for some of the HR professionals that are looking at not only those job descriptions that I talked about, but also interviewing and also bringing folks on to the next step of their application journey.
Well, you just were mentioning how important this might be in screening, but it really is useful across the board. The NICE framework, because it establishes that common language, is used to align curriculum to these needs. It's really about understanding what the employers are needing and being able to translate that into this language as well, so that we are having that as a whole common ground upon which to rely. The HR professionals can then use that in order to speak with their cybersecurity managers to understand what the needs are, what their workforce needs are, be able to understand where their gaps are, be able to identify those and use that common language in the job descriptions and in those job announcements, so that when applicants come in, applicants are both aware of what is being asked for, so they can understand by using that common language, they are able to see where their skills apply and where they're learning and where their experience actually fits into the job that you're hiring for. But it also ends up being something where you are able to share out in an accurate kind of way what you're looking for. I think it's really important. We often hear about how difficult it is to hire folks into this space, and having that consistency of language is really helpful in doing that. It also helps to understand that you're going to be putting out what you're needing now, and also understanding where you're going to be taking this position in the future. So you're not going to be trying to throw everything in the kitchen sink into that job description. You're really going to go ahead and understand what is realistic for a job position, understand how that's going to work with the rest of your organization, and how it's going to meet your cybersecurity needs. But it's also going to help as you're starting to develop your staff too. So whether it's that person that you've brought in and now you want to make sure that they have a way to continue to develop themselves, to move into other kinds of roles as things shift in your organization. Or as you pointed out, it may be looking at people who you have already in-house and understanding how their skills and knowledge can translate into cybersecurity and be able to support them through training, development, or career path work.
I know I am very guilty, especially in my past, of putting a job description together. And I'm looking at the job description like, it'd be nice if that individual had this. It'd be nice if that individual had that. Only to find out that I probably ended up screening out folks that could have been wonderful at the job right off the bat. So now I've learned a lot, and also utilizing this framework has been really helpful for me as well to look at, hey, what exactly are the requirements of the job? What are some of the nice to haves that potentially I don't need to put onto the job description? And then ultimately working with HR to make sure that I have a good conversation and a good conduit with the candidate through HR. You brought up an interesting point with HR asking some questions in terms of, hey, what are some of the priorities for the cybersecurity organization that they're trying to hire for? What are some thoughts that HR may potentially have, or potentially some questions that they might be able to ask the cybersecurity group that they're ultimately trying to hire for that could guide HR into the right direction to get the best candidate possible?
I think a lot of times it may come down to those requirements. It is about the screening, about an assessment of those candidates and understanding how that might be done. So understanding, is it important for someone to have maybe able to evidence the competency, as we did introduce competency areas with our 2020 revision, to be able to broaden that pipeline. So it's not just relying on maybe an academic degree, but understanding how is someone going to behave or understand maybe cloud cybersecurity generally, and being able to translate those into your organization. Is that an area of need? So looking at things from maybe a slightly different perspective in order to open up that pipeline, to be able to really prioritize things like diversity, equity, and inclusion in your hiring processes as well. And really just to understand about what are the requirements on day one, maybe what's going to be needed on day 30, and see if there's going to be with the folks in your team a process to get people ready. So will you need someone to come in on day one and be able to use your organization's unique systems and applications? Or is it that they have some of that already, they use a similar application and that can translate, and you'll give them a few days in order to get ready? So it is understanding exactly what is needed at that start date, what can you build up? And again, where is your organization going? So with your strategic plan, looking 3 years out, where is it that you want to build towards? And is this candidate going to be helping you get there?
I take a lot out of what we said already, right? We're going to be able to utilize this from the HR perspective, from a 200,000 person organization all the way down to a 2-person organization, potentially even one, right? But we could utilize it for large and small. We could utilize it against different sectors. We could utilize it public and private as well. Let's delve into some of the details of the framework, because the details of the framework are really going to help us out in terms of understanding how we could utilize this framework to be able to help our HR professionals really get the right candidates along the way. And there's a few key terms that you had brought up, and I think it'd be good to start going through some of those as well. So obviously, if we go through the framework, we see things called tasks. We see things that are in terms of knowledge and skill. And I know those are only three of the components, but I think from, again, a high level, how can we start understanding some of those details of the framework in order to utilize it in our particular hiring processes?
Those task knowledge and skills really are the foundation of the NICE framework. It says, they are the building blocks, and we call them TKS statements. They really serve as the basis on which everything else is built. So the task is a short statement that describes what someone needs to do in a specific area of work. They usually start with the verb, and they really are very intent on describing what someone's going to need to do in their job. I do want to clarify that in the NICE framework, we use the word work roles, and that is a difference between a job or a title and a work role. So you might be in the occupation of cybersecurity, and you might have a job title of cybersecurity analyst, but in the NICE framework, that might mean that you are actually responsible for more than one work role. It could be that you're responsible for, threat assessment, as well as being a defense analyst. So it could be that there are different kinds of ways that you're looking to build up what this job is that you're doing. And for each of those work roles, they define a group of tasks, which is that kind of role would commonly be responsible for. And so looking at those tasks is understanding from that workplace perspective what they're going to be doing. But you can each task is going to be aligned with knowledge and skills, and understanding what someone needs to know or be able to evidence to do, what you can actually see them do in order to complete that work. And that's really focused more on what we call in the NICE framework, the learner. And the learner is a broad way of describing things, people, including students, including people who are looking for jobs, as well as existing staff. It's a broad catch-all term that we have. And so you could look at it from a task perspective, which is more about the work to be done, or from that learner perspective, which is kind of where we're doing what we're focusing on when we're bringing up the competency areas. Although the competency areas are for us as still groups of task, knowledge, and skill statements, we're really focusing more on what the person is able to know and do, and how they're bringing that to that area of work. It's a more broad base of area of work. Whereas with the work roles and focusing on the task, it's looking at the job, what is specifically needs to be done. So it's really they're almost like two sides of the same coin, and it depends on your organization and which way you're going to go about it. For instance, you might have a team where you know specifically what needs to happen and you know what exactly needs to be done on that one. You're going to be wanting to focus on it from then that task or work role level. If you're uncertain about the actual work that needs to be done, but you know what kinds of areas of work you're going to need, what kinds of people you're going to need to bring into that. Is it going to be someone around procurement and cybersecurity? Is it going to be someone who's going to be more about understanding what systems our cybersecurity needs are? So looking at it from that perspective, you're going to be focusing more on the learner or maybe the competency area kind of things. And so that way, then when that team gets built, those tasks can be laid out. And so it really is about flexibility. It's going to be a little bit about diving into the framework as well, but understanding your needs is going to be paramount before you do that.
So as we start looking at tasks, it sounds like the task is something that, hey, that is the requirement in order to have the job done completely. It's a yes or no or a check mark. And then as we start building upon some of those tasks, obviously, like what you had brought up, the candidate or the individual who's filling that role needs to be able to have certain levels of knowledge, right? And that knowledge is ultimately going to be that person to be able to be successful in the tasks. Now, one thing that you brought up as well, it sounds like, especially if you're just building up your cybersecurity workforce, and you really just don't know what the tasks are just yet. And hey, that can happen, right? Especially if we're just building up a cybersecurity workforce, or we're just getting our company off the ground. We know cybersecurity is really important. We want to start somewhere, but we just don't know where to start. It doesn't sound like you need to start with the tasks. It sounds like you may be able to start at a little bit higher level in this particular framework, correct?
Absolutely. There are over 1,000 task statements that we have. I wouldn't recommend starting there. We do have 52 work roles. Those are organized into 7 different categories. And so starting maybe at that category level of understanding generally what kinds of things that are going to be happening in an organization is probably a better way to begin. So we have ones that are around oversight and governance, for instance, and types of roles that might be in that space. Ones that are around securely provisioning cybersecurity and understanding what kinds of things might be needed there. There's operations and maintenance. And so there's going to be those kinds of requirements. So it really is about those kinds of different areas of work. You may be an organization who's really focusing more on the protection and defense of your, when it comes to cybersecurity. So depending on where you are, if you're just starting out, if you're just sort of doing initial review, you're going to maybe look more at those oversight and governance and understand, where do I even begin? Do I need to start with maybe just developing policies? Or is it that I need to start looking at how to develop cybersecurity awareness across my organization? I think that's a really another important point to make, is that even though the NICE framework focuses on a workforce for cybersecurity, that workforce is not necessarily for everybody who's in cybersecurity only. Across your organization, there's going to be needs for cybersecurity awareness. There's going to be needs for cybersecurity in all sorts of different kinds of jobs, anything that is touching technology nowadays. And so understanding that some of these things may be important for people who might not think of themselves as cybersecurity professionals too. And it might help your organization be able to bring that mindset to your staff as a whole.
So it sounds like from the, hey, just starting up your cybersecurity workforce, maybe we start looking at things a little bit less from that task perspective and start looking at it from, hey, what do we do to help develop some of the policies, some of the security awareness, some of the things that are going to require us to start building up the task, but we may not have it 100% there yet. So there's a lot of great things that we could take from the smaller organization standpoint, but let's flip it around a little bit. Let's just say that, hey, I am an HR professional from an organization that has 100,000 or 200,000 people, and there is a cybersecurity group already in place. How do these tasks ultimately help the HR professional really build up, not only looking for candidates, but also the skills of the existing folks that are in the roles already?
For those large organizations, and there are a number of them that do use the NICE framework, and really it's a lot of times more about using it in a more in-depth kind of way. It's around that workforce assessment and workforce development that really starts to be where those kinds of organizations are able to really test the limits of the NICE framework and be able to put it into practice. Because you might have staff that are already there, but if you don't understand, if you're not tracking your workforce and understanding which staff are responsible for what roles, where are those responsibilities, who is doing this kind of work, you're not using the NICE framework to its fullest. And so by having that be part of your ongoing job description updates, reviews, as making sure you understand who is where, you're able to then identify, are there gaps as well? Compare it to the rest of the NICE framework and say, are there areas that we are not in really including people, and we need to focus in on that so that we don't end up putting ourselves at risk and put our organization at risk. And then it is about understanding about workforce development. You're going to be bringing people in, but they're going to be wanting to be able to develop their own careers too. So you don't want to end up spending all that time bringing someone in just to lose them. So it's a helpful tool when it comes to retention and development and understanding how do you use this to be able to identify career paths. There are a number of tools that are out there as well that use the NICE framework that can help visualize that. So for instance, CyberSeek is a great tool that uses a NICE framework that shows about, it pulls from different job descriptions that are out there, announcements, and it shows where there are needs, where people are hiring, what kinds of requirements they're having. It also helps with identifying different salary levels. And it helps to identify those career paths too. It helps to see if you're in one area, where can that person maybe go next? And so it really, from an HR perspective, it gives more insight into how can I see my workforce as a whole? How can I build it? How can I make sure that it's really, again, all about helping to meet those organizational needs and helping to manage risk of your organization?
I think that's really cool what you brought up there. Not only is this framework something that's going to be able to help us identify folks that may be able to enter the organization and sort of, I don't want to say assess their skills, but at least understand what that individual might be able to bring to the table compared to the task that may be assigned to that role.
Right.
But also really helping to develop the folks that are in roles as well. And I know from my perspective, many of the teams that I've worked with, that's a really exciting thing. to be able to train within the organization that you're already a part of, right? And also being able to train against essentially a framework as well, as we start being able to look at the
Right.
cybersecurity groups that we have, looking at some of the tasks or knowledge or skills that's ultimately required along the way. So there's really a lot of different parts to this framework, not just bringing somebody in, but also assessing and also retraining, upskilling, if you would, many of the folks that are already
Absolutely.
in our organizations, correct?
Absolutely. And it's, I think, important to realize, again, I'm going to go back to that term ecosystem, that this is not something that an an individual organization needs to do on their own. We have the NICE Framework Users Group. I mentioned Cybersecurity uses it. There are a number of other tools that use the NICE Framework as well that can be helpful, as well as lots of curriculum and training and certification organizations that are aligning themselves to the NICE Framework, so that if you are able to see, look, this person has this certificate, and I know it's tied to these NICE framework areas, and that's from our workforce assessment where we want to hire. It gives another way for you to assess candidates coming in, but also, as you mentioned, for upskilling needs. If there are people who in your organization who you think have great capabilities and you want to build up some more of those technical skills, you can identify some of those trainings available that may be external to your organization. If you're a large organization, though, as you stated, you might have staff in-house who are doing training, who are developing those courses too. And that's where using the NICE framework tasks, using the different work roles and competency areas to help build up that curriculum, to help build up those courses, can be helpful too.
Hey, a few things that you brought up there. I love the term certifications, right? And I know when I work with many of the HR professionals, that ends up being a really good benchmark for the HR professionals to ultimately use in order to try to assess the candidates, at least from the starting point, right? Of course, we always have interviews with the folks that do have those certifications, and we have some good conversations, especially from the hiring requirement side. But you mentioned some really interesting things there with certifications and badges and working with other organizations to really almost add some validity to the framework in order to showcase that people really do have some of these skills. Can you go into a little bit more detail of what some of those maybe certifications are, or who you've been aligning to, especially for the HR professional perspective, just so they might be able to do a little bit of extra research on it?
Well, there are all sorts of, I can't, sorry, um, I'll start over. There are lots of organizations that align to the NICE framework, and in different ways. There may be different levels of alignment too. So some are doing it at that very narrow task level. Some are looking at a higher level with the work roles or the competency areas. And so there are lots of different ones that are out there. I'd say any of the organizations that are working with certifications when it comes to cybersecurity, bring in the NICE framework. At times, they may make that more obvious with their websites and with their curriculum, and they may say specifically, look, this is tied to this work role. And in other cases, that's simply what the instructor has done on the back end of things. But I do know that overall, the NICE framework is oftentimes part and parcel of in a lot of these certifications. And really, as you mentioned, it can be really another helpful way of assessing a candidate and their capabilities. It also can be helpful for if you have an apprentice program to bring people in and help them get those certifications too. So looking at and understanding how these all work together is going to be very important in that process.
It's fantastic. And it's really cool to see how, hey, even with some of the certifications that are out there, there's a little bit of comfort, especially from the HR perspective, that it is aligning to the framework that we're discussing right now as well. And it gives a little bit of comfort, especially throughout the screening process, or potentially upskilling, reskilling, like you had talked about a little bit earlier as well. But we talked a lot about the tasks, and we talked about the skills and the knowledge required to perform some of those tasks. But I know there's a few other key terms that we want to make sure folks do take away from this webinar, and one of which is against the work roles. And I know that there are particular details about the work roles, whether it be the higher level definition of it or also some of the extra details underneath. But do you mind going into some of those details of what work roles are and how the HR professional may be able to utilize that throughout their journey of building up a cybersecurity workforce for their organization?
Sure. So we do have 52 work roles, and those are organized into 7 different categories. The categories are oversee and govern, securely provision, protect and defend, investigate, I think I maybe missed one, operate and maintain, and then analyze and collect and operate. The latter two, the analyze and collect and operate ones, are specific to intelligence roles, and so are subject to Title 10 and Title 50 regulations. But the other ones are really broadly used across, again, private and public industry. It is useful to look at them from that perspective because it's helpful to understand the kinds of areas of work. You find that for us, when we're speaking with K-12, for people who are just understanding that cybersecurity can be a career, it can be useful to look at them from that perspective of the different kinds of areas you can go in. You may be someone who's very technical and likes to do lots of code. There are going to be areas for that. But if you're someone who's more on the policy side, who is more on the management side, there are roles in that space too. And so by looking at those general categories, you're then able to go into those 52 work roles that we have and be able to see the different kinds of work that are in that space. It is just an easier way of understanding and the different kinds of groups of effort that might need to take place in an organization.
And just to make sure that we're all on the same page, what is the difference from your perspective of the tasks, the knowledge, and the skills compared to the work roles that we just discussed?
So a work role is comprised of tasks. It essentially is made up of a number of related tasks in that area, and it will show what someone or perhaps a team is responsible for in your organization. So if you are understanding that this work needs to be done, with the NICE framework, you're able to sort of point to who or what team is responsible for making sure that work is done. And so that really is it's comprised of those tasks. The tasks then in turn are tied to the knowledge and skill statements, which describe what someone needs to know or be able to do to complete those tasks. And then and so that really is just another way of understanding how these can be used and how, if you're talking about work that has to happen, how does that translate into that workplace context? It's, knowing the word work in a very academic kind of training or textbook way is one thing, but it's really important for the NICE framework to be able to translate that into the job, into the environment where this is happening, and understanding that connection of the individuals with the work to be done.
Okay. Yeah, makes total sense. Makes total sense. Hey, just out of curiosity, especially I'm thinking of some of the organizations that are just building up their cyber workforce. Do they have to have every work role attached to their cyber group, or how does that work from a smaller organization standpoint?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. And I would expect that most organizations will not have all of these work roles. And certainly, and that even translates into our tasks and knowledge and skill. This is meant to be a starting point. It's not the ending point. It's not a standard. It's not a requirement. It's a place where an HR professional can begin and then be able to use this to say, these are the kinds of things we're thinking about. Some of these pertain to our organization, but some might not. And so which one of these do we want to make sure are brought into what we do here? And that same thing applies to the knowledge and skills. We have a framework that is meant to be used broadly. And because of that, we aren't specifically stating things like use this specific application, use a specific tool, as much as more broadly speaking, types of tools that someone might need. And so you may want to, as an HR professional, add in some more detail. Use this as a starting point and add in and say, look, for our requirements, we need to have this person be able to use it. It's in the statement, it says they need to be able to use this kind of tool. Okay, which tool specifically are we using in our organization? And put that extra information into your own system and be able to understand how does that translate to your local needs. So
it's really cool. So I could utilize the framework, but I could also add additional detail, it sounds like, huh?
Exactly. And really the framework and the way that NICE and NIST work is very much community-based. We understand that cybersecurity is not static. There are going to be changes and we are updating our content. And that only happens in conjunction with and really lockstep with the community. So hearing from these organizations about what their needs are, understanding where their roles are maybe shifting and how we might need to make changes in order to also reflect that and reflect the changing needs of a cybersecurity workforce is really important. So it is about building out that connection with everyone too. If people are uncertain, I mentioned the NICE Framework Users Group is a great place to go. We have a number of other communities of interest and working groups here at NICE where we encourage the community to engage with us and be able to share with us what their needs are so we can build out additional resources, build out those guides that can be helpful to them as well. But yes, it's absolutely meant to be very flexible and be able to be, used as you see fit for your organization.
I love the flexibility aspect of it. I think it's really helpful for especially HR professionals because look, cybersecurity looks different in
Mm.
almost every organization, but there are obviously are a lot of similarities along the way as well, where we're trying to reduce risk and we're also trying to build up our workforce along the way as well. Cool. Well, hey, I know we've talked a lot about tasks and skills and knowledge. We talked a lot about work roles, but there's other terms that I want to go over as well. And one is in regards to competencies. So as we start talking about competencies from your perspective, how would you define a competency in this particular framework?
We introduced competency areas with our 2020 revision, and we did so really in recognition of the fact that hiring approaches have been changing. It's shifting from a degree only to a degree and skills-based hiring kind of process. And so understanding that there are different ways of showing and demonstrating capability is what we were trying to achieve by introducing the competency areas. It also allows us to bring up areas of work that employers are particularly looking for. I think I used the example of cloud cybersecurity earlier, where even though that may be incorporated in a number of our work roles now, we're looking to have these competency areas, pull those out specifically so that those can be areas where an individual can demonstrate their capability, or for an employer perspective, where you can start to assess their capability in an area overall. So it's not necessarily at that very narrow task level of, can you do this one thing, as much as generally, do you have the knowledge and skills for this area to come and be able to share that expertise at our organization. We are looking at these also for areas. There are three different ways that we anticipate that the competency areas can be used. One is in a knowledge building kind of approach, where it may be that someone is looking at an area of work and wanting to say, for instance, with digital forensics, what are the general knowledge and skills that I might need in that space? How do I build that out? How can I translate that to this different organization? We also look at them where it could be an area of sort of a addition to an existing work role. So they're meant to work together. So it could be, for instance, with operational technology, cybersecurity, that there are some, system cybersecurity or network cybersecurity roles where they also will need to have that operational technology, that sort of cyber physical system connection, and be able to add that on to some of our existing work roles to help them translate that into the OT space. And then looking at that as in the same example space, so it may be someone who's in OT who may need some cybersecurity awareness. And so this is another way of bringing that to them. Or it could be more of a common ground. So a translation of a language for people, for instance, who are in policy area, who may need to have cybersecurity knowledge, and be able to use that language to translate and speak with cybersecurity professionals who are able to then also share what they have with that policy professional. So it does become that common ground of understanding and communication there. So there's the same foundational building blocks. It's just different ways of approaching it and really trying to build up that pipeline, broaden that pipeline into cybersecurity, looking at different ways of understanding the different capabilities that people can bring to a role and how to assess that.
It's always amazing, especially when I think about all the different requirements to build up a cybersecurity team, just how vast cybersecurity is. And hearing some of the examples, it's really great to have a little bit of comfort that there's a framework out there that could start being able to detail many of these requirements that ultimately are really helping to support many of the cybersecurity teams. And hey, just going back over to competencies for a second again, competencies versus work roles. What would you describe as that difference? I know competencies are added fairly recently into the framework, but as somebody just looking at the framework, how would you describe that difference between the work role and the competency?
With the work role, it is really more focused on the task side of the TKS thing, the building blocks, whereas with the competency area, it's really focused. So tasks being the work, whereas with the competency area, it's really more of a focus on the person and what they bring to it, the knowledge and the skills. The tasks are related in the competency areas, and knowledge and skills are in the work roles, but it's just a slightly different perspective of things. We're also looking at the competency areas as a way to bring in new areas of work. So for instance, with AI, where we're going to see cybersecurity requirements and needs in that space, but there aren't yet defined cybersecurity work roles in the AI very specifically quite yet. It's still an area of formation. And so it's a way for us to be able to highlight these areas of where there's interest, where there's cybersecurity requirements and needs in a way before they're maybe developed as common across the board work roles that we might see in all sorts of industries. And so it's really just a slightly different way of being able to look at different kinds of cybersecurity needs out there, and just broaden the ability for us to be able to hire people who have capabilities, be able to look at what we are going to want to develop in our workforce.
Reminds me a little bit of, I looked back at my resume from about 7 years ago, and I looked at the skills that were there and I said, hey, this is really different from what I do now. And I can only imagine how different cybersecurity is going to be in 7 years. Hey, even in 1 year, how different cybersecurity is ultimately going to be. Hey, from the HR perspective, does one have to utilize the work roles, the competencies, the task skills and knowledge together? Can they utilize it separately? How would you recommend, somebody utilizes these either together or totally separate?
They all can be used separately, but it does work nicely when they're together. So really, I think that it depends on how one might want to approach it and where they are in their own organizational efforts, in their own cybersecurity program. If it's about hiring, it may be a combination of the two with work roles and competencies, which again are comprised with TKS statements. So they're all sort of bundled together. It's hard to really get them away separately, but if you're looking at it from wanting to identify what work needs to be done, you're probably going to focus more on those tasks. If you're looking about developing out doing a training program, you're going to maybe be looking more at the knowledge and skills. So it depends on what your goals are. And that's really what's going to help lead you in the right direction as to which portion you're going to want to use. And it may be all of them.
Oh, awesome. Awesome. Well, hey, from a hiring perspective, how can this framework ultimately help with the HR professional to hire the best candidate? I know we've covered a lot of really cool terminology that could be utilized. And, I'm excited to go forward with this, especially with some of the hiring needs that I have as well. But how does HR utilize this to really help hone in on some of their hiring for their cybersecurity workforce?
It's all about those needs. If you know what needs you have and you're using that common language that we have defined in the NICE framework, you're able to go ahead and translate that out to people who are looking for your jobs. You're not going to end up having those misses. You're not going to end up having those people who are looking and coming to your organization and applying, and that's not what you're looking for. You want to be able to, if you're using the language that they're familiar with because they've seen it in their curriculum, in their previous work experiences, and then they're able to see that in your job description, you're going to get the right candidates. If you're putting out language that is unclear or putting out requirements that may be just not quite clear what the job is, if we're not seeing any kind of connection, if it's maybe like that I said before, if it's throwing the kitchen sink in there, you're going to end up missing folks who are really wanting to understand how they're going to see themselves in your organization. So it's about that common language. Again, it's if you're able to describe what the work is that you want done and be able to describe that well enough that you're able to get the candidates who are fitting for that makes a nice meet. If you're unclear about it, if you're not certain what you're looking for, and if you're not using that language, that's going to reflect in the kinds of people who are coming to your positions as well.
I think you bring up a really good point there, especially with entry level. So some of the HR professionals that I've talked to have stated, hey, we have some great development in terms of building up our cybersecurity workforce, but we've noticed that the vast majority of the job descriptions are really geared towards somebody who's been in the industry for X amount of time, right? And we tend to, not by default, but we tend to lose out on some really good candidates who are really meant for some entry-level cybersecurity positions. How can the framework be utilized to start bridging that gap and to start reintroducing some of the entry-level candidates? And it could be an entry-level, potentially somebody who's just entering the workforce, or maybe entry-level, maybe making a bit of a career transition over to cybersecurity, over to the HR professional. How can we utilize that framework or this framework in order to be able to help bridge that gap?
I think what we've seen with entry-level opportunities, there aren't as many, or there are ones where they're requiring maybe certifications that have a minimum of 5 years experience as part of the certification, and the HR professional isn't really aware of what the certification means. So at times it's an understanding that, looking at what the certification states as well, is it a 5-year minimum of workforce? But you're saying that you're having someone come in as entry level, there's obviously a dichotomy there. So understanding what the actual requirements are, but also understanding what you need on day one. And at times, I think it is about building out the workforce. There have been some studies recently that show that essentially a lot of what someone can bring into it is a starting point, gets them in the door, but you only would need about 6 months to get the person all of the other requisite capabilities that you would need for an early career organization. Position, and typically at a cost of around $1,000. So fairly minimal in terms of that training cost to get someone from in the door to meet all of your needs in a fairly short period of time. So thinking about things from that perspective, do you need to have that individual on day one be able to do all of these things? And maybe it's not a career entry position. Indeed, if you're willing to say that you want to have someone who's brand new in the field and you're willing to take that bet, but you also need to then develop out some of their capabilities, have in there maybe have in your planning some mentoring, have in there abilities for that person to network, have abilities for training. But having that built in, you'll get someone who's maybe earlier in their career, be able to get them in the door and be able to really maybe spend quite a number of years with your organization building out your needs for fairly low in time at the beginning and support at the beginning.
It sounds like, especially for that entry level or somebody who's making that career shift into cybersecurity, a workforce absolutely could bring somebody in who is entry level or is just learning cybersecurity. But it sounds like they need to be very prescriptive and could potentially utilize this particular framework in order to build up their skills over what you had stated,
Absolutely.
about 6 months or so, give or take. That sounds about right.
Absolutely. And so if you know from that position what you're looking for, what kinds of tasks are going to be done, what kinds of knowledge and skills you're going to expect, if you're able to be a little bit more flexible in the beginning and maybe not require people to have all those right hand, but they've got translatable skills. You have ability to see how they could build up some of those things fairly quickly. That might be a great candidate, understanding that you may need just a little bit of time in the beginning to be able to translate what they have into your unique organizational role. So having the NICE framework lay that out and be able to give you a path towards that is helpful versus having someone come in and kind of expecting them to learn on their own without understanding what it is that they're meant to be learning. If you're able to share with them, look, these are the tasks you need to build towards, these are the knowledge and skills you need to build towards, that gives them a way to be successful as well.
So it sounds like it's good for entry level, but we might be able to translate over to somebody who's making a bit of a career transition too, it sounds like, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we've recently started looking at developing out proficiency levels for the NICE framework as well. And that's going to help there as too, where we're able to show that some of our work roles are meant to be more flexible in terms of whether it's early career, mid-career, or later. Some may be only early career kinds of roles, or some may be really more focused on the later kind of career kinds of capabilities. Are you going to be a member of a team, leading a team, or setting strategic direction for that team? So understanding what it is that you're looking for in these roles, I think the proficiency levels will help with that and be able to help understand if you're in doing a career switch, switching into cybersecurity, but you're at a sort of mid-level in your own career. Are there comparable levels in the cybersecurity positions that can bring those knowledge and skills, bring that capability and those soft skills into that role and be able to help make sure that you're going to be successful in the new field of cybersecurity?
Take it from the entry level, from the mid level, all the way up to the senior level, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we have all those different kinds of roles reflected in the NICE framework.
Oh, fantastic. Hey, this has been a wonderful conversation. Just to wrap it up, hey, how does somebody engage with the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, or with NIST in particular? I know you brought up a few different items, but how does one engage with this framework?
Well, NIST is all about community. We're always about making sure that we're open and engaging. All of our processes are very much done that way, and NICE is no exception. Every time we have new content updates, we put that out for comment. We want to hear from folks about what is working, what isn't working. We're always looking to address gaps, looking to build out and make adjustments so that we are meeting and reflecting current as well as future cybersecurity demands. And that's really going to be important to hear from people, practitioners, including HR professionals, about what they're looking for and what their needs are. So it's about engaging with us via those comment periods, but it's also, we hold online workshops, we hold monthly webinars, we have a quarterly e-newsletter, and then we have communities of interest, both the NICE communities of interest in certain areas, as well as working groups who really do help us meet some of our strategic goals. So there's a lot of different ways that you listen in, or you can be, knee deep. It's up to you.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. And again, it sounds like it's not just for cybersecurity professionals or those trying to get into the industry. It absolutely is for HR professionals as well to really help with this framework, it sounds like, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's meant, it's really is a broad community of everyone, from those learners to the employers, HR professionals, the academics, the curriculum providers, certification, and it's really across the board. We want to hear everybody and have everybody work together to build out this framework and make sure it's useful for everyone.
Karen, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot about the framework, and I'm looking forward to utilizing it not only throughout my career, but also working with HR along the way as well, to not only identify how we can start bringing in the best folks into our workforce, but also help developing the folks that are already in our cybersecurity teams already. So again, Karen, thank you very, very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it as well.